What if I told you I'm covering one of the most popular online games ever and you've never heard of it? Even further, we're covering a sequel to that massively popular game that actually only ever came out on Xbox. Huh? Sure, you might rightfully say, hey nerd, isn't PC your focus? Which is true, but we also cover other online games, and since the game in question, the sequel to the first Crossfire, is Crossfire X, never came to PC despite the possibility, it still feels quite relevant to cover, at the very least, for a story of what could have happened. Now don't click away yet. Yes, I know that Crossfire is largely seen as a pay-to-win game by those that know about it, with a largely Chinese-focused Counter-Strike clone of sorts of a market, but it actually is one of the most successful games ever globally, with multiple billions in revenue grossed. On top of this, the development of the sequel, Crossfire X, which launched in February of 2022, is incredibly intriguing as well, because it featured two different development studios, Smilegate, the Korean company behind Lost Ark, and Remedy Entertainment, of Control and Alan Wake fame. With Smilegate handling the multiplayer and Remedy handling the single player, Crossfire X was supposed to leverage some of those global millions of players they had and make an impact for the first time really in the western half of the world. However, after just 1 year, Crossfire X would be shut down in record time, where it was then shut down in the summer of 2023 ultimately. With Crossfire X no longer playable completely, yes, that includes even the single-player component of the game, no longer accessible, and the game no longer purchasable, it's time for Crossfire X to find itself on the Death of a Game series, a series where we diagnose the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death, or eventual death, and do such through the navigation and review of a timeline of events and various clues. This all culminates in a final deduction at the end of the episode to crack the case for good, and make sure you, the detectives as well, were paying attention. Thank you for supporting the channel and series, and consider joining our YouTube memberships or Patreon to further show your gratification for the content that we produce. Our content is free, so enjoy it. Just make sure to comment, like, and subscribe every now and then though, so we both get a benefit, you get the chance to see more of my videos, and I get more of you as my viewer, and more engagement. Without further housekeeping, let's get to the case. The story begins with the incredible success, not entirely expected at least by the western half of the world, of Crossfire, a Korean free-to-play shooter that is very similar to Counter-Strike in aspects but takes more of the anime arcade look and approach. Crossfire launched back in 2007, where since it has managed to eclipse over 1 billion users and gross nearly $7 billion. Crossfire's success, however, largely came from its gargantuan Chinese market, despite being a South Korean game, who was a little newer gaming-wise, at least with online gaming. Developed by Smilegate, yep, the same Smilegate behind Lost Ark, Smilegate would team up with Tencent, mega Chinese publisher, to publish their game in China, which would lead to it becoming one of their most successful games ever, even over League of Legends some years. Crossfire and many other titles like it though, such as Sudden Attack and Combat Arms and more, were products of their time. These free-to-play shooters made sense in the early 2000s because many players, myself included, couldn't afford paid games. These games also focused their efforts mostly elsewhere besides the US, for example. The business models of the shooters that were mentioned were simple. You could play for free, but then you could actually pay to rent different weapons for different periods of time. Now sure, you could grind for the normal currency to do the same thing, but the premium currencies were always more effective, naturally, at having more purchasing power. The games weren't as competitive focused as Counter-Strike, yet not as arcadey as something like Call of Duty entirely. I played Combat Arms growing up personally, and the allure of these games works great for someone who doesn't have the means to play the other games that cost a lot of money. But it was like 10 years in the future now, and rumors of a sequel was on the way. Would Smilegate be able to do it again with the sequel, in a more modern time, where many high-profile shooters are now free to play by default, and computers, as a whole, having far more increased power and decreasing in cost, making them more accessible for more demanding games? There was a serious question there. Crossfire X, the sequel to Crossfire, was announced June of 2019, and the biggest kicker being that the game would actually only be set to launch on Xbox, with no promises of a PC launch yet, despite the original game being on PC only. This was bizarre, to say the least, but perhaps the idea was to try and attract a more Western audience, but then what about your own Eastern audience, who likely isn't as keen on Xbox, statistically speaking anyway? Who was Crossfire X being made for? The free-to-play players on Xbox? That seemed like a much smaller piece of the pie than the pie that they already had. Some gameplay, and mostly trailer footage though, would be revealed following the announcement, even featuring a DMX trailer. Huh? X gon' give it to you. I mean, I like DMX, but why DMX? Sure, it kind of fits, but I guess what I mean is like, this feels a little bit like How Do You Do, Fellow Kids, like the South Korean edition. While the look of Crossfire X was a cool mix of retro and realism, the target audience was a strange and limited one due to their choice of platform. The open beta for Crossfire X would take place June 2020, and although the game played decently enough, like a Crossfire sequel would sort of play, maybe a few years ago, but it was being criticized from the jump due to the confusion of who was developing the game and its direction. And there were multiple reasons for that. That's because Smilegate, the South Korean publisher, and Pangyo Sangnam was handling only the online portion of the game, and Remedy Entertainment, the Finnish publicly traded video game cult lover in the industry, would be handling the single player. Remedy Entertainment, with a strong narrative background coming from games like Alan Wake and Control, would be lending their expertise to the single player. This wasn't a problem at all. The problem was that both modes were essentially different games. That's right, Smilegate was using a different engine, Unreal 4, while Remedy was using their own in-house engine, the Northlight engine. This can easily be seen in the contrast in gameplay, with even things like the UI and HUD, but more importantly, gameplay, physics, and even the graphics. And even worse, those who played the single-player portion felt like it wasn't even a Remedy game in the first place, which either means that Remedy did a bad job of injecting their DNA into the game, had limited involvement, or were just kind of taking a contract to make some money, let's be honest. The same month they were announcing Remedy Entertainment being in charge of the game's single-player, Smilegate was celebrating massive success with their Crossfire TV adaptation, the show leveraging the massive popularity of the series and esports in Asia. Crossfire, now a 13-year-old game, was celebrating breaking 1 billion users, positioning itself not just to keep making Smilegate more money in the future, on top of their Lost Ark money, by the way, which is already another money-making titan in its own right, it was setting them up for the upcoming sequel. The issue is, and actually Jack Frags, a YouTube commentator, points this out in his coverage of Crossfire, is that the audience is already mostly Asian, meaning that you would have to change aspects of the game if you wanted it to become a hit in the West. And I think it's kind of foolish to assume that it didn't do well in the West originally, just because it never had exposure or didn't have enough of it, when its existence and success is basically due to the counter of that particular market. Crossfire X on Xbox was going to struggle to leverage any of these billions of users or whatever, when those were PC users, right? The launch for Crossfire X on Xbox One and Xbox Series X and S would come February 10th, 2022, and the reception was anything but positive, scoring a series record low 38 out of 100 on the aggregate review website Metacritic. So bad it scored the second worst game of 2022, and the year just started. IGN's Travis Northup would review the single-player and multiplayer separately, which made sense due to the different feels and approach of them, starting with the multiplayer. Travis would call the multiplayer painful, rating it a 2 out of 10 and stating that it wasn't worth the price, even though it was free. Crossfire X's multiplayer is just a disappointing console version of a PC shooter. It's simply speaking, poorly designed, including the game modes and the piss-poor performance. And regarding the single player, Travis wasn't a fan of the lack of remedy to the story, rating it a 3 out of 10, going even a step further, calling the campaign sloppy, soulless, and mercifully brief. Also describing Crossfire X's campaign as a by-the-numbers project by Remedy. Oof, I hope you guys got paid, Remedy. Meanwhile, Polygon, known for their leniency at times, would call Crossfire X Remedy's biggest blunder yet. Though, hopefully they're laughing to the bank, right? Or perhaps we should kind of be mad that they sold this half-effort packaged as a Remedy game, even if it was free.
Money, 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 money.
Feel however you guys want, though, and let's focus on the case. Smilegate wasn't giving up yet, and would strike back at the critics with a major update promising more content, a new massive map, for 15 versus 15 battles with vehicles and objectives, much like the first Crossfire actually had as well. But besides that, there would be a menu UI overhaul, better pooled game mode systems, and playable mechs, though only in limited fashion on the new map, Babylon. I won't deny it, it's kind of a bit strange after just covering Blacklight Retribution recently, especially because that game came out in 2012, and then covering Crossfire X. Not only did Blacklight Retribution have more content, it also had better gameplay and was made by a studio with far less money. Now, going back to Crossfire, the Babylon update was good, and certainly needed, but it was beginning to feel like perhaps just adding more content year by year was not enough to keep people interested, especially with such fierce competition. Worse, because Crossfire X was made for a global audience now, instead of its own home audience and then kind of adapted, it failed in its own home market too, where no more rumblings of the franchise spawning more games is even mentioned much. Though to be fair, that's after a failed battle royale as well, called Crossfire Legends. That's not to say that you can't make a game for the global market, obviously we have tons of examples of that. However, besides Overwatch and like Valorant, most Western shooters, in particular, aren't nearly as popular in the East. These markets clearly like and prefer certain things, and it's difficult to appeal to both of them unless you have like Riot or Blizzard type clout or experience. I mean, the most played shooters in Korea are Overwatch, Valorant, and then like Sudden Attack, and those trade back and forth in terms of which one's ranked first. Now, Crossfire tried to address this with the concept of having a modern mode and a classic mode. It seems to attack that problem kind of head on. Instead, though, you have a game that focuses on two different styles with two different engines made by two different companies, where it offers not only very little base content, but also feels like a weird hodgepodge mixture of things without any actual feet put in the sand somewhere where you can state this is what our game is. Simply adding some tactical elements to the modern mode wasn't going to be enough to attract a new player base, so perhaps Crossfire was just better off focusing on the classic mode, which is what it, as a series, already did well. Objective-focused gameplay with a more fun-focused shooter gameplay where accuracy wasn't kindly like the near, end-all. But I think their desire to build essentially two different games speaks to their conflictedness regarding a new direction for the game, and that likely has to do with their massive existing audience for the previous game. But if that audience already exists and you just want to market to them, why not just make a more iterative game, like the more classic version of whatever Crossfire X became? And if not, why not take more risk in making something more iterative? Instead, we get a game marketed to multiple audiences and a confusing effort made by two different developers in different ways, and in the end, no one really wanted to play it. Crossfire X would be announced to be ending its service later, just 1 year after its launch. The reason cited for the shutdown was despite multiple attempts, they felt that the game was just not where it needed to be. Whether that's the acknowledgement of a faulty foundation, or more so them not being sure what works, but trying everything, I don't know. But I don't like the shutdown reasons that are listed because they don't really acknowledge the community much, and frankly speaking, that's always a red flag, though it shouldn't be confusing. Because what community? The majority of their community was on PC. It's like making a sequel to the Kit Kat bar, but removing the wafer or some shit. Candy. Crossfire X officially shut down May 18th, 2023, and in a shocking turn of events would not just shut down the multiplayer portion of the game, but would actually shut down the single player portions too. This meant that Crossfire X was an always online game, or at least was being treated like one. This means that you can't even play or purchase Crossfire X in any fashion anymore. And this is also a reason we've covered some strictly single player games not like Crossfire X, for example like Marvel Avengers before, or Godfall, because these games also ended up being shut down. But if we can't play Crossfire X anymore in any fashion, and there's no story of like a community revival, because, well, there really wasn't a community, that means, cue the music fed, this case has come to an end. With the timeline terminating, most of you probably have already collected all of the clues as to why Crossfire X died so soon. But in case you didn't, the game features two different devs with two different engines. They tried to make an Eastern game work globally without accounting for such. It had a poor content and value offering. Crossfire X offers pretty much nothing better or different than BLR did. Microtransactions in a shooter just don't really go well with the rest of the world. It was Xbox only. Now, we don't need to belabor the point, detectives. Crossfire X failed, and like many titles trying to bridge the gap from east to west, it resembles a resounding lack of awareness of the market you are intending to, well, market to, and sell to. There's an argument to be made, though, that the style of free-to-play shooters famous in Asia don't work in the West. I mean, we don't really have any evidence of that after all. Which means if you wanted to bring Crossfire X to the West, you had to consider changing the core monetization, and thus foundation of the game. And then the argument sort of is, like, why? Is it worth it? For Crossfire OG fans, I mean? Because Crossfire X didn't feel like a sequel. It didn't feel like it was made for the OG fans, as much as it felt like it was trying to capitalize on its popular name while making all of the kinds of mistakes in the process, showing a lack of awareness. Maybe if Crossfire X's approach succeeded with the modern and classic mode, that could have been a formula for other games to make sequels, but it didn't. Instead, we kind of got the worst of both worlds. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode because boy, it's a doozy.